Hello and welcome to a special little mini episode of Ballin in the Boot. This is, of course, Gridiron Football beat writer Alex Allison. Today I am not joined by Jace Lejeune. It is a special little situation, of course, for this week, and this might be the situation moving forward. So, normally, of course, in Ballin in the Boot, Jace talks to various people individually about their games that week. Whether it's me, Daryl, Tyler, Aishure, everybody, as well as Grant Sachere with Crescent City Sports. However, this week, the Ball in the Boot episode was filmed a little bit differently. It was a roundtable discussion with me, Daryl, and Grant, and we just talked about all of the playoff brackets, previewing all of those exciting matchups, giving our predictions for how we think the brackets will go. So, because of that, there were no individual game covering videos within that episode. And that's not much of a problem because we had a chance to talk about, sort of the individual games that we went to briefly during the week, during that video. However, for me in particular, it's a little bit different because I also cover Southern. So I'm not just covering high school football on that show, I'm also covering Southern and their games each week. So this is the episode to supplement that. That I'll also talk about Southern's game, and especially this week's game, because it is a game that has to be discussed. It's a game that we have to give as much coverage to as possible, because it might be the most entertaining game of the season in the SWAC this year. So, let's get right into it. Southern 25, Bethune-Cookman 23. A game that went to 5 overtimes. Lots of takeaways to go through in this game. First off, and perhaps most importantly, Southern is now 1 win away from clinching the SWAC West, setting up almost certainly at this point a date with Jackson State, a rematch from the Boombox Classic played in September in the SWAC Championship. We'll have a lot of time to talk about that game when it does get clinched, possibly after this week. All Southern needs to do is either defeat Arkansas Pine Bluff next week or watch Alcorn State lose to Prairie View A&M. So Southern just needs to win one more game, or Alcorn State needs to lose any one other game. So whether it's this week or next week when they play Jackson State, or Southern will have one more chance to do it in the Bayou Classic the week after. Okay, so that is the most important thing, that regardless of how this game went, a win is a win, and a win gets Southern one step closer to clinching the SWAC. And at this point, you could argue that's really all that matters. That being said, there were a lot of concerning takeaways from this game. Southern didn't look good. After a couple of games where it sort of felt like the Jags were kind of doing this upward trajectory and kind of, in the words of Coach Graves, getting off the roller coaster and starting to take the escalator. The big win against Alcorn State, and then of course they came up short against Florida A&M, but then Xavier T said the first quarterback all season to play an entire game for Southern was able to do that against Alabama A&M last week. So we go into the game, and Bethune-Cookman has the worst defense in the SWAC, and they're one of the worst teams in the SWAC, probably the second worst team in the SWAC via record. And we're expecting this to be, especially coming back home, Bethune-Cookman had no fans. I'll talk about that in a little bit. That came to the game, I mean. And all of that should be okay. ZT said it's going to start the game. The offense is going to be rolling just like it was last week. And it seems like Southern is going to be fine. That's not what happened. All of a sudden, we're staring down the barrel of a game at the end of the third quarter where the score is 3-0. Bethune-Cookman is winning the game 3-0 after 3 quarters, and Southern is completely shut out. And after 2.5 quarters, of course, ZT is benched. Of course, the big story of this game is not that ZT was benched, but who he was benched for. Not the other main name, if you've been following Southern throughout the season, of Noah Bowden, but instead fellow freshman Jalen Woods. Jalen Woods had a couple of appearances throughout the season. He appeared briefly in, I believe, the Prairie View game. He also appeared briefly in the Nichols game in garbage time. However, he didn't have a lot of serious snaps. He had like a drive in the Prairie View game. He had a couple of drives in the Nichols game. Nothing too serious. And so it felt like this was always going to be a competition between Bowden and T-Set every single week. All of a sudden, when T-Set is struggling, can't move the ball on offense, he's like 8 for 18 completions for like 100 yards in that first half. Cannot put up a point on offense. Instead of turning to Bowden, Coach Graves turns to Jalen Woods. And I keep going back to, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago when, like, the first or second time this happened. I keep going back to the first article I wrote about Southern this season, back in August, a couple of weeks before the season started, at the very end of fall camp, where Coach Graves finally names his starting quarterback. And everyone was sort of expecting it to be a lot sooner than that. It felt very late in the process, like days before, the week 1 game against McNeese, kind of, you go into practice mode for that week. And so that felt odd to me at the time, that it came so late into the process. And it was something I questioned. But as the season goes on, the decision to wait as late as possible and give all 3 quarterbacks, not just Bowden, not just T-Set, but also Woods, continual chances with the other starters throughout the season has continued to pay dividends. Because every single time you have a starter that struggles in the game, he gets benched. He gets benched for another player that has had reps with the ones all season long. It's been a continual quarterback competition from game to game, from practice to practice, all season long. And that quarterback, when he replaces the starter, has looked comfortable every single time. Jalen Woods becomes the 3rd quarterback this season, the 3rd different quarterback to come in, replace another quarterback in the game while losing, and lead the Jags to a comeback victory. Bowden did this twice. In both of the overtime games, he started, was benched, came back in after a deficit, and then led the team to a victory, both against Prairie View and Texas Southern. Xavier T-Set also did this against Savannah State, originally winning the job in the first place. What we thought at the time was this cataclysmic thing for the quarterback position and the quarterback race turns out to be just the first chapter in many quarterback changes throughout the season. And then he also did this in a tied game against Alcorn State, replacing actually an injured Noah Bowden as well. And then, of course, now Jalen Woods doing it down by 3 in the game against Bethune-Cookman, replacing Zay T-Set and coming back and winning the game. So, every single time this happens, it makes the season more and more unique. Because what the decision that Coach Graves signaled at the beginning of the season to wait so long, it should have told us at the time, and I think I didn't really internalize this until fairly late into the process, that every single time one of these quarterbacks gets replaced, it isn't a cataclysmic decision. What I mean by that is it doesn't have these huge ramifications moving forward. Think about what happens when a quarterback gets benched most of the time. Usually that's a decision that carries a lot of weight to it. When it happens, you're going to wait 2 to 3 weeks before even considering going back to the original option. If you follow the NFL, you've seen this with Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco, Bryce Young and Andy Dalton. In college, we saw this with Connor Wigman and Marcel Reed, with Jackson Arnold getting benched for Oklahoma. All these various teams, when you move on from your starter, you move on from your starter. And it's a long time before you go back to potentially coming back to the original starter. That is not how it has been for Southern this season. And Coach Graves made that very clear from the beginning. He benches Noah Bowden in week 1 for Zay T-Set. Bowden starts week 2, gets benched again for Zay T-Set. Zay T-Set looks like he has the starting job. He gets hurt. Bowden comes back in. He gets benched once for Jalen Woods, comes back in, and wins the game against Prairie View. And then from then on, it's whoever's healthy, whoever has the hot hand, Rarely, if ever, is the quarterback going to play the entire game. Only once in 10 games has that happened. He said in the Alabama A&M game. And now it has some huge positive consequences for the team because it's not the same problem to the mental game of the quarterback to be benched because unlike those situations where Richardson gets benched, Young gets benched, Arnold gets benched, all of these different players getting benched, where you're like, okay, I'm not going to get another chance for a long time. That's it for now. You get the feeling that, okay, Zaitsev was benched. Look, for example, Zaitsev was benched last week in the middle of the game for Jalen Woods. He knows that there's just going to be another competition the next week. And if he wins it during practice this week, he's going to be the starter against Arkansas Pine Bluff. He knows that it is that quick. It could be a matter of a series, 2 series, a quarter before maybe you get another chance. If not, the very next week. Jalen Woods was never in this conversation all season. And he just slowly works, keeps being told every week, this is a competition. You're going to get your chances. If you keep working at it, if we think you have the best chance to bring us to a victory, you're going to get your chance in a high-leverage situation. He was being told that, and because he watched Bowden and Tisa trade off the position week in and week out, he believed it. And so for every single week this season, he kept working at it. He knew he was going to get his chance. He finally did, and he made it pay off. The offense looked completely different after Tisa was benched and Woods came in. Woods didn't light the world on fire through the air or anything himself. He was like 5 for 10 for 50 yards. But the offense itself was just executed more efficiently. On that day, Jalen Woods was the best quarterback for Southern. Is that going to be true next week? We have no idea. It has never felt more murky, the QB situation, than it does right now. Because now you have a day one starter, Noah Bowden. Is he third on the depth chart now? Has he been surpassed by not one but 2 players? Because that's how it felt last Saturday. So hats off to Coach Graves for handling the quarterback situation in a really mature way, in a really effective way. And it's the reason why Southern is in the position they are in to potentially win the SWAC West and get another crack at Jackson State in the SWAC championship game. Because if he just named Noah Bowden the starter much earlier in fall camp, and when Bowden struggled, he didn't have the right people to turn to, this team would not be 6-4 and 5-1 in the SWAC. A lot of these close games would not have turned into victories. So, genuinely hats off to Coach Graves for that, and the entire coaching staff for making those decisions and handling what has been a very precarious QB situation as well as they have. So, that is the story of T-Set to Woods. The offense struggles, and then they were able to move the ball going into overtime. The run game really turned on in the fourth quarter going into overtime as well. But now I want to talk about a couple of specific situations that happened in the game and kind of how we got here in the game itself. So, T-Set struggled. He gets benched for Jalen Woods. The score is 3-0. And it could have been a lot worse. I'll be honest. I've watched games in the past where you come out of halftime or you go into halftime and you're like, we're tied or whatever, or we're winning by 3, but it feels like we should be winning by a lot more than that. This was the opposite. Southern was down 3-0 at halftime in this game, and it kind of felt like it should have been a lot worse. It should have been like 10-0, 13-0, maybe even 17-0. That Southern should have been kind of out of this game at halftime. And that's not what happened. Because Southern's goal line defense made a huge stand that kind of kept the Jags in the game in the second quarter. It was already 3-0 late in the second quarter, and they make a huge goal line stand. First and goal, second and goal, third and goal, goes to fourth and goal, up 3-0 in the second quarter. Bethune-Cookman decides to go for it, and they get stopped. So that kind of sets the tone for a lot of this game, where both offenses, when they were able to move the ball, were able to do it fairly effectively. However, they ran into the problem of not being able to actually get in the end zone once they got too close. when they scored touchdowns, they usually scored them from pretty far out. And if you're within the 5, within the 3, within the 2, they just couldn't quite break through and get those final yards, either having to settle for a field goal or getting stuffed. Which brings us to one of the most interesting points in the game. Okay, so let's set the stage. Like I said, at the end of the third quarter, the score was 3-0. Bethune-Cookman was up. Jalen Woods, in the final drive of the third quarter, is brought in as the starting quarterback, subs in relief for Zayt said, who got benched. And the offense immediately starts moving. He starts generating positive plays, keeping the offense on schedule, no mistakes, no penalties. Again, not lighting the world on fire through the air, but handing the ball off, going through his progressions, all of those sorts of things. And they get down to first and goal on, I believe it was the 3-yard line. Hand the ball off, get stuffed. I believe there was an incomplete pass in there. They hand the ball off again and come up just short. So we get to one of my favorite kind of discussions in all of football, which is the strategic kind of game theory decision that comes to, what are you going to do on a 4th and goal or 4th down situation? Do you go for it? Do you kick a field goal? Sometimes you're asking, do you want to punt the football? I love the 4th down decision making and what goes into that decision from the head coach. And so I just want to talk about this a little bit, because a decision was made that ended up not working out, that there were plenty of people afterwards that were like, oh, well, he should have done this, but also they were like, well, I think I would have done it too. We're just kind of looking at it from a results-oriented standpoint now, where we saw what he did didn't work out, and it ended up costing them greatly, sending a game to overtime that Southern could have won in regulation. But was it the right decision? I think I would have done what Coach Graves did. That was generally the sentiment after the play happened. I'm going to pose an alternate theory, and this isn't to say that he made the wrong decision. He made the decision that most people would make, and it's not faulting him or criticizing Coach Graves for the decision. All I'm doing is having a discussion about the decision, because I think it was really marginal and really interesting. I've done this before in past games where you're like, okay, do you kick a field goal here? Do you be conservative? Do you go for it? That sort of thing. I just want to present the case for not doing what he did, even though I think the decision was completely understandable. So, like I said, 4th and goal on the 1, down 3-0, the third quarter ends. It's the beginning of the 4th quarter. And Coach Graves decides to go for it. The offensive coordinator, the offensive team decides to go for it. Southern goes for it. They get stuffed short. Bethune-Cookman takes over on the 3-yard line, because it's a 2-yard loss. It was a really, really bad, just the play ended up going really poorly. Southern turns the ball over on downs the same way that Bethune-Cookman did earlier in the game. So, I was on the field, and I turned to a person standing next to me during the quarter change, and I asked him, am I crazy for wanting to kick a field goal here before the play happened? And I just want to present the argument for why maybe kicking the field goal is the correct decision, regardless of, even if he had scored a touchdown, I think it might have been the correct decision. It's maybe the decision I would have made. Here's why. Ultimately, that sort of marginal case is, I think, heavily dependent on what the score is of the game. So 4th and goal on the 1, do you take the 3? Do you go for the 7? If the score is 31-28, 27-24, 41-38, something like that, then I think usually you're going to want to go for it, because A, you have confidence in your offense to get the job done, and B, you kick a field goal in a situation like that, you need 7s, you don't need 3s. You are really worried that they're just going to go down and score again, and instead of, in a situation, this was a 3-point deficit, right? So instead of tying it up and then maybe getting a chance to get the ball back with the game tied, they're going to go and score at least something, and you're not going to get that chance. You're going to be right back where you were, if not worse. This situation, I don't think was that. First off, Southern got stuffed 3 times in a row, right? This wasn't a situation where it was 1st and goal in the 8, 2nd and goal in the 5, 3rd and goal in the 3, 4th and goal in the 1. I think it was 1st and goal on the 3 or 4 yard line, and Southern was having a really hard time moving the ball down the field. So, First off, how much confidence do you have in your offense to get that done? Secondly, score is 3-0. The offense has not gotten on the board all game long. There was a part of me that was just feeling like you just want to get on the board, get a little bit, because there's just something really demoralizing about having a 0 in the scoreboard. And points are at a premium in a game like this when the score is 3-0 going into the fourth quarter. And so there was a part of me that's just like, do you just want to take the points and not put your defense in that situation of having to go on the field while trailing in the fourth quarter? And that can make things really tense. That has its own dire, effects. I think analytics-wise, the decision's always to go for it on 4th and 1 in a situation like that. So it's not really even like a one of those like gut versus numbers situation. My gut was just telling me I kind of, maybe that's overly conservative, I don't know. I kind of wanted to kick a field goal in this situation. But, you can't really fault Coach Graves for making that decision, ultimately, because, A, we don't know all of the details. We don't know what he feels about his offense, what he feels about the play calls, that sort of thing. Or B, there's just so much that we don't know that goes into that decision. I just like having that discussion because I think it's really interesting, and especially in a situation that's as marginal as that. So that's the case that I made for potentially kicking a field goal there. Regardless, it didn't work out. They don't get the touchdown. The one thing I do want to finally address is the one final thing to consider in a situation like that is part of what makes it so marginal, is that even though they got stuffed, you could argue it still worked out for them, because Bethune-Cookman gets the ball on the 3-yard line. They can't really do anything. You just have so far to go at that point. They go 3 and out. They punt it. Southern gets the ball in Bethune-Cookman territory, and they drive down and score a touchdown on the next drive. Does that happen if they kick a field goal and then, Bethune-Cookman gets the ball at the 25? Even if they get a 3 and out, maybe that's 20 more yards Southern has to go to score a touchdown. So that also matters. Maybe it still worked out best for them. So I'm not even saying that it was a complete disaster what happened, but there are certainly worlds where you're really missing those 3 points as the game goes into its final stretches. And the game goes to overtime, of course, 5 overtimes at that. And there are definitely times where I think, in the back of my mind, in the back of a lot of people's minds, it's like, man, those 3 points would have been nice to potentially avoid all of this. But, butterfly effect, neither here nor there. The decision was really marginal, like I said. Just an interesting, there's so many layers to a decision like that. It's part of what makes one of the very, very many reasons why being a head coach for a football team is so difficult, right? Because you have to manage the players, the personalities, your assistant coaches, and on top of making a game theory decision like that, that's really difficult. It's just hard to do. And so, it's a marginal decision. It is what it is. Ended up sort of not working out. But Jalen Woods and the momentum that he generates, injecting a sort of, sign of life in that offense, ends up making the difference. So, like I said, Bethune-Cookman goes 3 and out, gives Southern the ball in plus territory. Jalen Woods leads the drive down. They score a touchdown. Great. 7-3. And at that time, I kind of felt like Southern could sort of exhale, because the lead is so valuable in a game that's so low scoring. Bethune-Cookman hadn't scored a touchdown all game. So I felt like up 7-3, Southern's got this in the bag. Well, hats off to the Wildcats, to Bethune-Cookman, for their resilience in a game that they should not have been in this game. Just from a contextual standpoint, on the road, long road trip from Daytona Beach, they had a really, the fan turnout was not good in the game. And I'll go into that more in a second, because there's a part of it that's really funny. I don't want to rag on the Bethune-Cookman fans, because I think I'll go ahead and talk about this now. I don't want to rag too much on the Bethune-Cookman fans, because I think it's totally reasonable, right? The team's 2-7. They have 1 win in, I think both their wins are in conference, but they're 2-7. They're out of the race. It's a really long road trip. It's a cross-divisional road trip. It's not a big rival. Southern's the favorite to win the SWAC West, so you're not expecting the game to be close. So they, a lot of the fans missed out on what was an awesome game, although, kind of a heartbreaking finish for Bethune-Cookman. But, before I say the thing that I think is sort of funny about this, I just want to make it clear that this isn't like ragging on the Bethune-Cookman fan base. Totally reasonable to have, like, honestly, like, shout out to the people that did come because it's understandable. Okay. All that being said, there were, I think, like 10 fans at the game, and when Bethune-Cookman proceeds to score a touchdown to take the lead, resilience of that football team, I have never heard less of a reaction from the stadium. It was, you could hear a pin drop. It's part of what makes the performance so perplexing, right? Because the team just didn't. There was so much home support for Southern relative to Bethune-Cookman that it just, this game being close didn't make a lot of sense, and it felt like Southern was underperforming. This Southern defense was doing really well, and then once they get the lead, Bethune-Cookman drives right back down the field. Again, a lot of resilience, a great performance from this team. They go and take back the lead. So now down 10-7, Southern has to go get the ball back and try to tie the game or take the lead with like 4 minutes to go. They do so. Or no, it was like 7 minutes off. Southern 3-minute drive. Jalen Woods does it again. Drives down the field, kicks a game-tying field goal. This time on like 4th and 2, they decide to kick the field goal. The game is now tied 10-10. And I think what'll get lost in a lot of this is a very long episode, but what'll get lost in a lot of this is the game that happened in the final like 3 minutes. So the game is tied 10-10. That ends up being the final score at regulation. But those final 3 minutes were insanely chaotic. So Bethune-Cookman gets the ball back. They punt the ball to Southern with 2 minutes to go in the game and 2 timeouts. And we're thinking, even though Southern gets pinned deep on like the 5-yard line, we're thinking, okay, Jalen Woods has a chance to go lead another drive and go win the game in regulation. He starts driving down the field, gets like a first down, another first down, and then he launches a ball that gets tipped up by the Bethune-Cookman defensive back and intercepted. And now, all of a sudden, Bethune-Cookman has the ball back at midfield with 2 timeouts left and a minute left to go in the game. They only need like 20 yards to get a chance to win the game in regulation with a walk-off field goal. And in that moment, everyone is freaking out. Oh no, this is a disaster. The Southern defense gets back on the field, bows up, forces 3 negative plays in a row, backwards, including 2 sacks. I don't know, it was like a sack, a really big sack, and then it was like 3rd and forever. It was like a draw play. They got a few yards, and they have to punt. And we go to overtime. Some crazy roller coaster, Coach Graves called it a roller coaster. It's a roller coaster. A crazy roller coaster from Southern's going to win, Southern's going to lose, Southern's going to win, Southern's going to lose. Okay, we're in overtime. And that's everything just before overtime. Just in regulation, we had all of that. And a 10-10 game, this game was crazy. Okay, so now we get to overtime. And the 2 offenses that were struggling the entire game were placed right at the right point in the field for them to explode, the 25-yard line. Not the 5, where they couldn't move the ball, but just close enough so that one chunk play is basically a touchdown, and that's what we saw. So the regulation touchdown was scored by Chandler Whitfield, a returning Chandler Whitfield, so congratulations to him for Southern. And then in overtime, C.J. Russell scored one of the touchdowns after Kendrick Grimes broke off a chunk play, and then Kendrick Grimes scored a 1-play, 25-yard touchdown in the second overtime. So it was Southern had the ball first, had the Kendrick Grimes, so it's a 2-play touchdown drives. Kendrick Grimes like 20 yards, and then C.J. Russell the last 5 yards. They get the ball, 1-play, passing touchdown, and the game is tied. Again, 17-17. They get the ball back, Bethune-Cookman does, in double overtime. They score another touchdown on like 2 plays. And again, they're up 23-17. They go for 2, and they don't get it. because the theme of this game ultimately was the strength of these goal line defenses. They could not get a 2-point conversion. Over the next 4 overtime periods, Southern gets the Kendrick Grimes touchdown and then can't get the 2-point conversion either. For the next 3 overtime periods, because starting at third overtime in college, it becomes a sudden death 2-point conversion shootout as the two teams trade 2-point conversion attempts. We saw 6 consecutive failed 2-point conversions by both teams. They both failed with a chance to win the game in the second overtime. And then once we got into the shootouts, they both failed in the third overtime. They both failed in the fourth overtime. They just couldn't break that line. We saw a pass breakup by Xavier Spencer. We saw a completed pass in a 2-point conversion attempt with a chance to win the game for Bethune-Cookman. Get stopped just short. He gets tackled like a foot behind the goal line to send us to a fourth overtime. In the fourth overtime, Southern stops them again. They have a chance to win the game, and they come up short with an incomplete pass. We go to a fifth overtime, where after a bunch of passing attempts to try to get those 2-point conversions, Southern finally decides, okay, you know what? We're going to try to hand the ball off. They hand the ball off to Kendrick Grimes. Grimes punches it in, gets those 2 yards. Southern takes the lead 25-23. And finally, needing a 2-point conversion to keep the game going, Cameron Ransom drops back and is dropped for basically a sack. I think he might have gotten back to the line of scrimmage, but he was well short of the 2-point conversion of the goal line. Southern can finally breathe. They win the game 25-23 in 5 overtimes. The Jags win and escape, barely evading the upset over Bethune-Cookman. I kind of talked about the takeaways already. This was just sort of the narrative of the game. I've been here for a very long time, so I think that will be about it. Southern moves on next week to Arkansas Pine Bluff with a chance to win the SWAC West. I will see you guys next time for more coverage of the Southern Jags as well as all the football in the area. Make sure to check out gridironfootballusa.com. Thank you.